The sound of shattering glass cut through the music like a blade, and for a moment the entire ballroom went silent. I turned just in time to see my son stumble backward into a table of champagne flutes, his hand pressed against his cheek, his eyes wide with a kind of shock. I recognized immediately not just pain, but the particular devastation of a man who had finally been shown exactly who someone really was. My son's business partner, the man who had stood beside him at the altar, as best man only 4 hours earlier, was standing 3 feet away, with his fist still raised, and his collar open, and his eyes burning with something cold and deliberate. And his older brother, the one sitting in the leather chair by the bar with his whiskey glass and his expensive haircut, leaned forward slowly and said with a smile that I will never forget for as long as I live, about time somebody knocked the idealism out of him. He never knew his place. In that moment, everything I had spent 32 years building as a federal cybersecurity investigator clicked into a single, perfectly clear thought. I reached into the inside pocket of my suit jacket, pulled out my phone, and scrolled to a name I had not dialed in 11 years. My name is Walter Greer. I am 64 years old. I spent the better part of my career hunting people who hid behind screens, behind corporate firewalls, behind layers of encryption and shell companies and plausible deniability. I had taken down fraud operations that spanned 3 continents. I had testified before Congress twice. I had seen things that would make most people lose faith in human nature entirely. None of that prepared me for watching my own son get hit in the face at his own wedding reception by the man he had trusted with everything he had built. Let me tell you how we got there. My son is my only child. His mother passed when he was 11, and I raised him alone through the years that matter most. I will not pretend I was a perfect father. I was gone too much, too consumed by cases that felt urgent and world-altering and, in retrospect, were never as important as the boy sitting at the kitchen table doing homework by himself while I was on a flight to somewhere classified. But he turned out remarkable anyway, which I attribute entirely to him and almost nothing to me. He started his software company 6 years ago out of a 2-bedroom apartment with $30,000 of savings and an idea that most people told him was either 10 years ahead of its time or completely impractical. It was neither. Within 3 years, he had 40 employees, 2 major contracts with healthcare networks, and a valuation that made his original investors look very smart. He was 31 years old, and he had built something real, something that mattered, something that helped hospitals track patient data securely in a way that had never been done before. His business partner came into the picture about 4 years ago. He was older by a decade, well-connected, with a background in enterprise sales and a network of contacts that my son, brilliant as he was technically, simply did not have. The partnership made sense on paper. My son brought the product, his partner brought the relationships. Together they landed 3 of their biggest clients inside of 18 months. I did not like the man from the first time I met him. There was something in the way he spoke about my son's work, a possessiveness that did not match his actual contribution, a habit of using I when he meant we, and we when the credit belonged entirely to someone else. I mentioned it once, carefully, the way you mention things to a grown child who has every right to make his own decisions. My son laughed and told me I was being protective and that his partner was just old school, that salespeople talked that way, that it was nothing. My son's fiancée agreed with me, which made 2 of us and did not change anything. The wedding was held at a venue outside of Nashville, Tennessee, on a Saturday in October when the leaves had turned and the light came through the windows at an angle that made everything look like a photograph. 300 guests, dinner, dancing, the whole production. My son looked happier than I had ever seen him, and I spent most of the evening sitting with that happiness, the way you sit with something you know is fragile and want to protect. I noticed things over the course of the evening. My son's partner drank more than he should have. He gave a toast during dinner that spent approximately 40% of its time talking about his own role in the company's success, and approximately 15 seconds actually congratulating my son and his new wife. He interrupted my son twice during conversations with investors who had flown in for the occasion. Small things. The kind of things you file away and do not yet know what to do with. The incident happened just after 10 o'clock. The formal portion of the evening was winding down. The band was playing something quieter, and I had stepped away from the dance floor to get some water. I was near the edge of the room when I heard voices rising near the terrace doors, my son's voice and his partner's voice, and the particular register that two people use when they are trying to argue without being heard. I moved closer without making it obvious that I was moving closer. 32 years of field work. I caught fragments. My son was saying something about the quarterly numbers, about a discrepancy he had found, about needing to talk to the CFO on Monday. His partner's voice dropped lower. I could not hear the words, but I could hear the tone, and the tone was not the tone of a man having a business disagreement. It was the tone of a man issuing a warning. Then my son said, clearly enough that I heard it, "I'm not going to let this go. There's something wrong, and I need to understand what it is." That was when his partner hit him. Not a shove, not a grab. A closed fist punch to the face that sent my son into that table of champagne flutes and filled the room with the sound of breaking glass, and my son's new wife crying out, and 300 people going instantly and completely silent. His older brother, the one in the leather chair, made that remark about idealism and knowing his place. He said it quietly, but not quietly enough. I did not hesitate. I pulled out my phone and called the name I had not called in 11 years. Victor Huang, former NSA analyst, currently running a private digital forensics firm out of Washington, D.C., the best person I had ever worked with, and someone who owed me a favor of sufficient magnitude that he had once told me it was essentially unlimited. He answered on the second ring. "Walter, it's been a while. I need you tonight," I said. "I mean right now, Victor. I need you working tonight." A pause. "Talk to me. My son's business partner just assaulted him at his own wedding reception. I have 32 years telling me this is the surface of something much larger. I need you to start pulling threads." "What's the company?" I gave him the name. I gave him both partners' names. I gave him the older brother's name for good measure. "Give me 2 hours," Victor said. "Keep your son from doing anything that could compromise a case." I walked across that ballroom with my heart hammering and my face completely still. I had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing you can do in a crisis is show the people causing it exactly how angry you are. My son's new wife had her arms around him. My son was upright, his cheek already beginning to swell, his eyes moving around the room with the look of a man processing too many things simultaneously. His partner was standing with his arms at his sides and his lawyer face on. Yes, I thought immediately, that is exactly what that expression is. I have seen it 1,000 times. That is not regret. That is calculation. The older brother had not moved from his chair. I went to my son first. I put my hand on his shoulder and leaned close and said quietly, "Don't say anything else to him tonight. Not one word." "Are you hurt badly?" "I'm fine. Dad, I know what he did. I saw it. 300 people saw it. That's handled." "What did you find in those numbers?" My son looked at me, and I watched him make the shift the way he used to make it as a kid when a situation suddenly became something I needed to know about. I found a pattern of vendor payments that don't match any contracts I've ever signed. Going back 18 months, maybe further. Amounts between 40 and 200,000 to 5 different companies I've never heard of. "Do you have copies?" "Encrypted backup on my personal server. He doesn't have access to that one." "Good." That was the most important thing he had said in the last 5 minutes. I straightened up, walked over to my son's partner, and stood close enough that we were speaking privately, but not so close that it would escalate. He met my eyes with the expression of a man who was used to being the most powerful person in any room he entered. "You just assaulted my son at his wedding," I said. My voice was level. "That is a criminal matter, and it will be treated as one. I am asking you and your brother to remain on the premises until the police arrive, because anything else is going to make this significantly worse for you." He smiled at me. It was the smile of a man who believed, genuinely and completely, that his money and his connections made consequences optional. "Mr. Greer," he said, "I've had too much to drink and I made a mistake, and I'll apologize to your son in the morning. This is a family matter. Not everything needs to become a federal case." "Interesting choice of words," I said, and walked away. I spent the next 30 minutes doing what I had done for 32 years. Observing, documenting, making quiet calls. I spoke to 3 witnesses who had clear sightlines to the altercation and got their contact information. I spoke to the venue's head of security, who confirmed that the cameras on the terrace had been running and offered to pull the footage. I called a former colleague at the Nashville field office and told him what had happened, and asked him to send a patrol car, not as a favor but as a professional courtesy, because what I had witnessed was a criminal assault, and it needed to be on record. The police arrived within 20 minutes. They took statements. They photographed my son's cheek, which had developed a bruise of impressive and unambiguous clarity. They spoke to the partner, who was quiet and careful, and made no further comments about family matters. They spoke to the older brother, who said almost nothing and whose quietness I found more interesting than his earlier remark. The partner was not arrested that night. The assault charge was filed, but he was allowed to leave. His older brother left with him, and as they walked out through the venue's main entrance, the older brother glanced back at me once with an expression that I could not quite read and did not yet need to. My son and his new wife stayed at the venue that night, at my insistence. I told them to sleep, that everything else could wait until morning, that he had done nothing wrong, and that the only thing required of him right now was to let the people with the right tools do what they did. I sat in a chair in the lobby with a cup of coffee and my phone and waited for Victor Huang to call me back. He called at 2:17 in the morning. "Walter," he said, "I need you to sit down for this." "I'm already sitting. Your son's partner has been running a systematic embezzlement scheme against the company for at least 2 years, possibly closer to 3. The 5 vendor companies you mentioned, none of them exist. They're shell entities, registered in Delaware and Wyoming, all with the same registered agent, all created within a 6-month window, about 26 months ago. The payments your son found are just the ones visible at his access level. I'm seeing evidence of parallel payment structures buried 3 layers deep in the accounting system. Conservative estimate right now, and I want to emphasize right now because this number is going to get larger, is somewhere between $1.2 and $1.8 million. I closed my eyes. Is the older brother involved? That's the part that's going to surprise you. The older brother isn't just involved. Based on the financial flows I'm seeing, he's the architect. Your son's partner is the operator. But the structure of these entities, the way the money moves, the timing this, is somebody who has done this before and done it carefully. I'm already finding 2 previous companies where the older brother had some kind of advisory role and where the pattern looks similar, though the other companies were smaller and the amounts were lower. A serial predator. Not a man who had made opportunistic bad choices, but a man with a method, a blueprint, a practice system for inserting himself and his brother adjacent to successful businesses, and systematically extracting value until there was nothing left to take. Victor, how long has my son's partner known about the discrepancies my son found? A pause. Based on what I'm seeing in the system access logs, he's known your son was getting close for about 3 weeks. There are traces of document access and some file movement that suggest he's been trying to cover tracks. 3 weeks. My son had been getting close to the truth for 3 weeks, and the man had been quietly erasing evidence. And tonight, at the wedding, when my son had said plainly that he was not going to let it go, the partner had panicked and done the one thing that people with good plans sometimes do when the plan starts to fall apart. Something stupid and violent and irreversible. The punch had been fear wearing the mask of aggression. I thought about something else. Victor, the major healthcare contracts. Is the fraud isolated to the vendor payments, or is there any indication that the clinical data side has been compromised? Another pause, longer this time. I was hoping you weren't going to ask that. That's not an answer. I'm seeing anomalies in 3 of the client-facing data environments that I can't explain yet. They might be nothing. They might be my son's partner cutting corners on the technical side to redirect budget. Or they might be something else. I need more time, and I need someone with your son's system credentials to authorize a deeper look. Patient data. If they had been cutting corners on the security infrastructure that protected hospital patient records to redirect money into their pockets, the exposure was not just financial and criminal, it was regulatory. It was potentially catastrophic for the company's clients, for hundreds of thousands of patients whose data was supposed to be protected, and for every contract my son had worked years to earn. I sat in that lobby chair until the sky outside the window began to lighten, turning over everything Victor had told me. And when I heard my son's footsteps on the stairs at 6 in the morning, unable to sleep, I was ready. I told him everything. All of it, including the part about the patient data, because he deserved to know, and because he needed to make informed decisions about what came next. I watched him go through the stages that people go through when a betrayal of this scale lands on them. Disbelief, and then a kind of nauseated confirmation, and then, finally, in my son's case, a stillness that I recognized. He had inherited it from me. It was the stillness of a person deciding to fight. "How long?" he asked. "Victor says 2 years minimum, likely 3. The older brother is the one who designed the system. Your partner executed it." My son was quiet for a moment. He was my best man. He gave a speech. He was standing next to me when I said my vows. There is nothing I can say to that, I thought. There is no version of that sentence that becomes less terrible. "What do we do?" he asked. "We do this correctly," I said. "We don't touch the financial systems. We don't confront either of them, and we don't tip them off that we know the scope of what we know. Victor needs 24 to 48 hours to build a documentation package that will be bulletproof. Then we take it to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, not because I want this to be slow, but because if we do it right, there is no way either of them walks out of this." My son nodded once. "What about the patient data? That's the part we move on immediately. If there's a breach, your clients need to be informed and your infrastructure needs to be secured. I have people who can assess that today without alerting anyone inside the company. Can you authorize them?" "Yes." "Then make the call." The next 48 hours were the longest of my professional life, and I have had some very long 48 hours. Victor and his team worked around the clock. I reached out to a former colleague now at the FBI's Nashville resident agency and gave her enough to understand why this needed dedicated attention without giving her so much that anything leaked back to either of the brothers. My son's new wife, who had every right to be furious at having her honeymoon consumed by a corporate fraud investigation, turned out to be extraordinary. She kept herself informed, she asked precise questions, and she did not get in the way. I decided immediately that my son had chosen well. The cybersecurity assessment came back in 31 hours. The news was not as bad as it could have been, and worse than I had hoped. The security infrastructure itself had not been compromised in a way that exposed patient data directly, but significant budget had been redirected away from scheduled security updates, leaving 3 client environments running on systems that were between 14 and 22 months out of date. They had not been breached, but they had been left vulnerable, and in the cybersecurity world, the difference between vulnerable and breached is sometimes a matter of weeks. The clients were notified immediately, professionally, and with a remediation plan already in hand. 2 of the 3 responded with exactly the gravity the situation deserved. The third threatened to terminate their contract, and I spent 4 hours on a conference call with their general counsel, explaining in terms that did not require a technical background exactly what had happened, who was responsible, and what steps were already being taken. They did not terminate the contract. On the 3rd day after the wedding, Victor delivered his documentation package. It was 112 pages of financial forensics, transaction records, shell company registrations, beneficial ownership traces, and a timeline that was so clean and so damning that my former colleague at the FBI called me back within 4 hours of receiving it and said, "Walter, where have you been for the last 11 years, and can we please have you back?" The warrant applications were approved in 48 hours. The older brother and my son's partner were arrested on a Tuesday morning simultaneously at their respective homes, before either of them had time to communicate with the other. The older brother's home, a property he owned outright in Brentwood, valued at approximately $2.3 million, was searched, and investigators found documentation relating not only to my son's company but to 2 previous operations, both of which had resulted in the quiet dissolution of small companies whose founders had never understood what had actually happened to them. My son's partner, when arrested, reportedly asked 3 times for his attorney before the agent reading him his rights had finished speaking. The older brother said nothing at all, which his attorney later described as instructed silence, and which the agents who arrested him described as the expression of a man who had known for some time that this day was coming and had simply not believed it would arrive this soon. The charges were substantial: wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and in the older brother's case, an additional charge related to the prior operations that investigators had begun building cases on in coordination with authorities in 2 other states. The total across all 3 operations was eventually calculated at slightly over $4 million across 7 years. The civil proceedings began while the criminal case was still in the pre-trial phase. My son's company sued for the full amount of the embezzlement plus damages. The shell companies were dissolved by court order, and their assets, such as they were seized. The partner's personal assets, the downtown Nashville condo, the investment accounts, the stake he held in 2 other ventures were frozen pending resolution. My son spent most of that period running the company, which had not stopped requiring his attention simply because his world had been upended. He hired a new CFO, a woman with a forensic accounting background who spent her first month essentially reconstructing the financial history of the last 3 years with the kind of methodical thoroughness that I found professionally admirable. He renegotiated the 2 contracts that had been most exposed by the security delays, and in both cases the renegotiations ended favorably. He brought on an outside board member with deep enterprise sales experience to replace the function his partner had served. He did not talk about what had happened at the wedding very much. When he did, it was quietly, and usually late in the evening when we were sitting on the back porch of his house, and the conversation had moved past the business matters and into the territory that fathers and sons sometimes find their way into when everything is quiet enough. "I keep thinking about the speech," he said one night, about 4 months after the wedding. How he stood up there and talked about partnership and trust and building something together. "He believed some of it," I said. "That's the thing about people like that. They're not always lying. Sometimes they mean the version of the truth that's most convenient for them." He was stealing from me while he was saying it. "Yes." My son was quiet for a while. "Did you know? Before that night, I thought about the answer to that carefully. I knew something was off. I'd known for 3 years, but I didn't know what. I want to be honest with you about that. I had instinct, and I had nothing else. If you'd asked me to prove it 2 years ago, I couldn't have. But you believed it." "I believed it." He nodded slowly. "I should have listened." "You were building something," I said. "You needed a partner, and he was there, and he performed for a long time. You didn't do anything wrong. You trusted someone who had worked hard to earn that trust specifically so he could exploit it. That's a generous way to look at it. It's the accurate way to look at it." We sat in silence for a while. The trial was 4 months away. The outcome, according to the federal prosecutors working the case, was not seriously in doubt. The documentation was too thorough, the pattern too well established, the testimony from the founders of the 2 prior companies too consistent. My son's partner had entered plea discussions. The older brother, who faced the more serious charges, had not. "I got a call yesterday," my son said, "from one of the other founders. The first company. He'd been running a landscaping software startup and lost everything when the company collapsed, and he never understood why. He's been blaming himself for 6 years, thinking he'd made some mistake, mismanaged something, just wasn't good enough." "What did you tell him?" I told him the truth. I told him it wasn't him. I told him it was a system that was designed to make him fail so that someone else could take what he'd built. I looked at my son. He was 32 years old now, a year past the wedding, with a company that had survived something that would have destroyed most businesses, and a steadiness in his face that had not been there before. Not hardness. Something more valuable than hardness. Clarity. "He cried," my son said, on the phone. "This guy I've never met just started crying. 6 years of thinking it was his fault." I thought about the older brother, sitting in his Brentwood house in his expensive suit, watching my son's partner land another promising young founder, thinking about his cut of whatever this one would yield. I thought about the calculation behind that smile at the wedding reception, the satisfaction of watching his system work again, the absolute confidence that nothing would ever catch up to him. "How is he now?" I asked. The other founder. "He's cooperating with the federal case. They've offered him restitution from the asset seizures, which won't cover everything but will cover something." My son paused. "He said he'd been thinking about closing the business he started after. the one he built from scratch after the first one failed. He said he couldn't trust himself anymore, couldn't trust his own judgment. He said this changed that. I did not say anything for a moment. That matters, I said finally. That's not a small thing. No, my son agreed. It isn't. The trial began on a Monday in February. The older brother, having declined all plea discussions, sat at the defense table with the same careful stillness he had brought to the wedding reception, and I imagined, to every moment of consequence in his life. His attorney was skilled, and his defense was built around the argument that the financial structures had been legitimate, that the shell companies served real business purposes, that any payments were authorized and documented. It was not a weak argument. It was the argument you build when the evidence is overwhelming and you are trying to create enough complexity that at least one juror gets lost in it. The prosecution was better. My son testified for 3 hours. He was precise and calm and spoke in terms that were clear enough for a jury of 12 people with no technical background to understand exactly what had been taken from him and how. His new wife testified about conversations she had witnessed and documented. The CFO testified about the forensic reconstruction. Victor Huang testified about the digital evidence chain. The founder of the first company testified about his experience and then, quietly, about the 6 years he had spent believing the failure was his own. I testified about the night of the wedding. I described what I had seen and heard in the exact sequence in which I had seen and heard it, including the older brother's remark about idealism and knowing one's place. The defense attorney did not linger on that section of my testimony. There was not much he could do with it. The jury deliberated for a day and a half, guilty on all counts. My son's partner, who had entered a plea, was sentenced to 11 years. The older brother received 19, with the federal judge noting specifically the pattern of behavior across multiple victims and the particular cruelty of targeting founders at their most vulnerable, people who had built something from nothing, and who had been systematically deceived at the moment they needed reliable partners most. The asset seizures funded a partial restitution to my son's company and to the previous founders. It did not cover everything. It never does. But the company was intact. The contracts were secure, and the team that had been built over 6 years was still there. I flew back to Oregon 3 days after the verdict. My son drove me to the airport, and we sat in his car in the drop-off lane for a few minutes, the way we sometimes do at the end of visits, neither of us quite ready to end the conversation. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "Tell me." I spent a lot of time being angry, specifically at myself for not seeing it, for trusting him, for letting it go on as long as it did. That's a normal thing to feel. I know, but I've been trying to get to a place past that, because if I spend all my energy being angry at myself for what I missed, I'm going to miss the next thing too. He looked out through the windshield. I think the real lesson isn't that I was wrong to trust. I think the lesson is that when people who love you tell you something is wrong, it's worth stopping to examine it. Not because they're always right, but because they're looking at something from the outside that you can't see from the inside. I thought about the 3 years I had carried the feeling that something was wrong, and had filed it away as the predictable overprotectiveness of a father who had never thought any person was quite good enough for his son. I thought about how much easier it would have been if I had pushed harder, spoken more clearly, trusted my own read of a man who was eventually proven to be exactly what my instincts had told me. He was from the first time we shook hands. "You're right," I said, and I should have been louder. "You made the call that mattered. I made it 4 years late." He shook his head. "You made it the night it needed to be made. That's what counts." He looked at me. "I've got something to tell you. My wife and I have been talking about what to do going forward with the company. One of the things we want to do is create a formal advisory board seat, a permanent one, for someone with experience in exactly the kind of situation we went through. Someone who can look at partnerships and structures and internal systems from the outside and ask the questions that founders are too close to see clearly." I looked at him. "Are you offering me a job?" He smiled. "I'm offering you the chance to be useful, which I've been told is the thing you care about most." It was not the most wrong thing anyone had ever said about me. The day I drove back to my house in Portland, I sat at my kitchen table for a while with a cup of coffee and thought about the arc of the whole thing. The wedding, the sound of breaking glass, the older brother's smile, the 48 hours in a lobby chair, while Victor Huang pulled a fraud ring apart from 1,100 miles away. My son on the witness stand, calm and precise, giving the jury exactly what they needed to understand the truth of what had been done to him. I thought about the other founder, the one who had spent 6 years believing the collapse of his company was his own fault, the one who had been ready to give up on the second company he had built from that failure. I did not know him well, but I knew that the evidence I had pushed Victor to find, and the willingness of the prosecution to build a broader case rather than a narrow one, had given that man his story back, had replaced the narrative of his own failure with the truth, which was that he had been targeted by someone with a practiced method and considerable skill in making victims feel responsible for what had been done to them. I thought about how many others there might be. How many small companies had quietly failed in the last decade, their founders walking away hollow and self-blaming, never knowing that they had been systematically dismantled. How many careful, patient predators were sitting right now in advisory roles and board seats and partnership agreements, running the same playbook with the same patience and the same confidence that they would never be found. I thought about the phone call I had made from that ballroom with the champagne flutes still breaking on the floor. 11 years of silence between me and Victor Huang, and I had picked up that phone without hesitation, not because I was brave, but because my son was standing 20 feet away holding his face, and there was nothing in the world I would not do to stand between him and whatever was coming next. That is the whole thing, really. That is the story stripped to its essential truth. You spend your whole career developing tools and instincts and relationships and expertise, and you spend it hoping that you will never need to deploy any of it in the direction of someone you love, because that means something has already gone terribly wrong. And then something goes terribly wrong, and you realize that all of it, every case worked, and every late night, and every skill painstakingly built across decades, was practiced for this specific moment. My son called me 6 months later on a Thursday evening. His company had just closed a new contract, the largest in its history, with a hospital network spanning 4 states. He had just hired his 38th employee. His wife was expecting a child in the spring. He told me all of that, and then he said, "I have a new partnership offer on the table. Major distribution company wants to take us into markets we can't reach alone. The founder seems legitimate. References check out. Numbers make sense." I waited. "I want you to look at the structure," he said, "before I sign anything, before I shake any hands." "Send me what you have," I said. "Already did." "Check your email." I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and pulled up the documents he had sent. The term sheet and the background information and the financial disclosures, and I sat there in the quiet of my house in Portland, doing exactly what I had done for 32 years, but this time for a client who mattered more to me than any case I had ever worked. I found nothing wrong. The partnership was exactly what it appeared to be. I told my son so, in writing, with my reasoning documented, and then I told him to have his CFO run her own independent review, and then I told him to trust his instincts, because his instincts had gotten him 38 employees and a 4-state contract, and a company that had survived a betrayal that would have destroyed most people. He told me my grandson was going to have a grandfather worth bragging about. I told him that was an extremely high bar, and I would do my best. I hung up the phone and sat for a while in the kitchen, with the evening light coming through the window, thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once. Somewhere in a federal facility in Tennessee, the older brother was in the second year of a 19-year sentence, sitting with the consequences of a method he had built over a decade and deployed without mercy or hesitation. Somewhere in Nashville, a 32-year-old man was running a company that had not broken, that had come through something terrible and come out the other side of it intact. One phone call does not fix everything. It does not undo the years of damage, or give back the time, or erase the particular loneliness of discovering that someone you trusted was performing trust as a mechanism of control. There is no phone call in the world that does those things. But one phone call can be the first step on the only road that leads somewhere better than where you are. One phone call, made at the right moment by the right person who has spent a lifetime knowing exactly who to call, can set in motion a chain of events that reaches further than you can see from where you are standing in a ballroom at 10 o'clock at night, with your heart in your throat and your son's face beginning to bruise. I am Walter Greer. I am 64 years old. I spent 32 years learning how to find the truth in systems designed to hide it, and I spent most of those years thinking that was a career. It turns out it was preparation. When you see something wrong, when your instincts are screaming and the evidence is starting to accumulate, and the people you love most are standing in the middle of something they do not yet fully understand, you do not wait. You do not weigh the social cost or worry about overreacting or tell yourself you are probably being overprotective. You reach into your pocket. You find the right number, and you make the call.